Hey everyone, Mr. Drake here. We have completed our study of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and we're going to move on to the next ancient civilization. This is the subject of Unit 3. This is the Indus Valley Civilization. So let's start off by talking a little bit about the geography of India. It's located on what we call a subcontinent, and a subcontinent is just an area that protrudes off of a larger continent. In this case, India protrudes off the southern end of Asia. Now, it's very isolated because of the mountains that border it on the north. On the northwest side, where you see those arrows there on the map, that's called the Hindu Kush. And the larger mountains that you've probably more likely heard of are the Himalayas, which is where Mount Everest is, the tallest mountain in the world. All the tallest mountains in the world are located in the Himalayas, and those border India to the northeast. So it's very hard for people to invade India. It's very hard for people to get there and interact with them, trade with them, because those mountains isolate them so well. The rivers flow south from the mountains in India. There's several very important ones. The Indus River is one, the Ganges River or the Ganga River, and also the Brahmaputra River. And those rivers carried melted snowfall down from the mountains into the more low-lying areas, which is what made agriculture possible. Now, probably the most important aspect of Indian geography has to do with the weather, and that's the monsoons. Monsoons are seasonal winds, and in the winter, the air blows from northeast to southwest, so it comes from what we would now call China. And it was very dry air, it was very humid, very arid, and it would basically wither the crops. But then in the spring, monsoons would come from the southwest and flow northeast, and they would bring moisture up from the Arabian Sea, and that moisture would then be dumped onto the land, and it would drench the land and gave the crops the water that they needed to grow. Now, monsoons were very important because if they were not normal in a particular year, there could be some problems. For example, if it did not rain enough, there may not be enough crops. Or if the monsoons came too late, the crops wouldn't grow and people would starve. At the same time, if the monsoons were too heavy, there would be floods and people could be killed and their property and cities destroyed. So the monsoons basically had to be pretty much perfect in order for this to work. Now, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, we don't know a lot about the Indus Valley civilizations, but we have found a couple of cities that are known now as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, and they weren't actually found until about 1920, so virtually nothing was known of ancient India until about 90 or so years ago. But you can see there are some artifacts that we have, some pretty impressive looking artwork there, and notice on that picture there of the city of Mohenjo-Daro just how similarly shaped the bricks are, which suggests something about their technology, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, even though we don't know a lot for sure, there are some things that archaeologists have determined based on artifacts and evidence that have been found at these cities. We know they were pretty large. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, both more than a mile across, which for the time was huge. We know they vanished without a trace about 2,500 years ago. There are various theories as to why this civilization collapsed, and we'll talk more about that near the end of this slideshow. The cities were very elaborate for their time. They had sewage systems, drainage systems in the houses. Houses had baths. There were even two-story houses, which for the time was very advanced. I told you to look at the bricks in the previous slide and how similarly shaped they were and how perfectly shaped they were as well. That leads us to believe they had a pretty elaborate system in place of manufacturing those. They didn't just put a bunch of mud out in the sun and let it dry. They went to some lengths to make these similar, to make it easier to build things. And the blocks were laid out in cities very, very precisely, a very grid-like system of roads and buildings. As far as their culture or history, we know virtually nothing. There are no tax records, no literature that's been found, no names of kings or queens. We don't even know the names of the cities, what they were called at the time. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are names that came from nearby cities, near where these sites were found about 90 years ago. But we think we know some stuff based on evidence. They were polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. Based on artifacts found, they appear to have worshipped bulls, and that makes a little bit of sense because today in India, if you know anything about Indian culture, they do consider cows sacred in religion there. The cities did have temples sort of at the top of the hill, which shows us that they had a religion and consider religion very important. Because the buildings were built so similarly and laid out so precisely, we think they probably had a pretty efficient, strong government in place. And because of that same reason, they were probably pretty good at math to be able to lay that out and survey the blocks and things like that. We think they probably traded with Mesopotamian civilizations as well. They found some things that are Sumerian looking in these cities. Now, again, we don't know exactly why Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and the Indus Valley civilization collapsed and when it did and why it did. But we know they were at some point invaded from the northwest through the Hindu Kush. There are passes, kind of low-lying valleys in the mountains surrounding India that people can get through. There's one very particularly important one called the Khyber Pass, and they were invaded by a group called the Aryans through the Khyber Pass about 2,500 years ago, and we'll talk more about them as this unit goes on. Archaeologists think they were probably weakened by something else before the invasion. There are various theories. Some people think it was a series of bad years with regards to the monsoons. There are hypotheses out there of an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. We don't know, but we do know that at some point, a once thriving civilization just sort of dropped off the face of the earth. So now that you've learned a little bit about the ancient Indus Valley civilizations, your next step is to complete a map activity. And to do that, you can use maps you find online, or you can use the maps on this slideshow. The maps in the first couple of slides should prove particularly helpful. We also have some readings on some kingdoms of ancient India that came after Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and we want you to check those out online. As always, ask your teachers if you have any questions. Thanks.